live online event at the Swindon Festival of Literature 2021. Thank you for joining us. We do hope that everything is well where you are. Now, please note, this event is being both recorded and live streamed online. And even though you are part of it, only the host and the author will be seen. If you would like to ask a question, please type it in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. If your question is chosen, you have a choice of asking your question in person and being seen on live stream, or asking the host to ask it on your behalf. If you want your question to be asked but do not want to be seen, please prefix your question with unseen. Phew, I hope that's all clear. Now, how can a child find answers to troubles it cannot name? How might we as adults best deal with a tricky childhood? How can characters in plays and stories help us reimagine and redeem the challenging people we encounter in our lives? What is the role of literature in all this? Today's guest is the author of a book which may have some answer to those questions. Its title is No Boys Play Here, a story of Shakespeare and my family's missing men. Set against the backdrop of family life and English history, No Boys Play Here roams through Shakespeare's plays in search of answers to today's continuing social divides between the king in his castle and the man on the street. Please join me in giving a Swindon Festival of Literature welcome to today's guest author, the first person from her county's care system to study at university, and now a tutor at the University of Oxford, and author of 2 previous books, Sally Bayley. Sally, welcome.
Hello, Matt. Thank you for having me today. It's delightful to be here.
Well, it's very nice that you're here in a manner of speaking, but you're only here online. Would that you were here in person in Swindon, because Swindon in spring is a lovely place. In fact, have you been to Swindon in spring or at any other time?
I have only been to Swindon by means of a train, and I have hovered about on a platform getting rather cold looking for a cup of tea. That's it.
Many people have been on that platform. One author this week wrote a poem on the platform. Next time we'll bring you into town. Okay, we better get back to the topic in hand. Your book, No Boys Play Here. A book that I found both, if you don't mind me saying so, Sally, disturbing but uplifting, as it told the story of the author in her teens in search of a father, an uncle, and broken lives, and all of it, to me, in a very unexpected way. Sally, please tell us more. Tell us why.
So the first thing I should say is when I write, I don't have a scheme in my mind. I wrote this book in the voice of a child. I went back into my child self, and I suppose the only way in which I could do that was to start with the songs, the ballads, the tunes, and the words that I heard as a child. Despite having grown up in a household that was in many ways very deprived financially and spatially particularly, and perhaps also emotionally, my mother did know some Shakespeare. She knew some Shakespeare off by heart. She knew the sonnets of Shakespeare, and she used to walk around the house chanting them and singing them and saying them out loud. So in some sense, I think those words, the sound of those words on the air, becoming buoyant, turning into something fairy-like, ethereal, not there, if you like, was my salvation. My mother loved Midsummer Night's Dream. She loved the character of Titania. She loved Titania's speeches. And in my imagination, I transformed my mother into the Queen of the Fairies. So that really was the beginning of my encounter with Shakespeare. It came through words spoken out loud as my mother moved around the house, often in her very old nightie, I should say. I think I say in this book that the uniform of the poor is 1 or 2 dresses. My mother dressed in her nightie, and then she had her going out dress and her indoor dress. So my mother wafted around our house. I say house, but actually it was 2 flats, 2 very small flats owned by the council. And I think that's really where I would like to to perhaps do a short reading to bring you into the world that I've built here from the sound of a child. It's the child's voice narrating all the way through, but the child's voice mixes up and blends with the voices of the adults that she grew up around, including her teachers, as well as the sounds and the words of Shakespeare's plays. I've mentioned Midsummer Night's Dream. That was my first Shakespeare encounter, but my second and probably my most generative encounter was with The Merchant of Venice, and then the history plays, Henry IV, Part 1 and Part 2, which brings us into the historical account of Tudor history that this book is built around, really. So I just want to give you just a taste of the world that you are going to enter into if you pick up this book. This is chapter 2, and it's called History. This is a tale of revolt, of mine, of men, of poor dogs and curs, woof, 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 of lost uncles and fathers. But before I can tell it properly, I have to decide what side I'm on, what side I'm on, what side I'm on. And I'm still getting the story straight. I'm sifting through the scraps. I'm sifting through the scraps. I'm sifting through the scraps. History is like that. It barks, woof, woof, and it barks. But it takes us a while to work out what it's saying. That poor dog that has none, woof, 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 woof. So sing him a song and give the poor dog a bone. This old man, he played too. He played knick-knack on my shoe. With a knick-knack, paddywhack, give the dog a bone. Woof! This old man comes rolling home. But where does home begin? When home keeps rolling away. Where does home begin? When home keeps rolling away. Sometime in the medieval period, says Mr. Drake, my history teacher. Everything starts there, children, in the medieval period. Get your notebooks out. History is all in the song you sing. History is all in the song you sing. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. In 1066, the Normans broke the Saxon sticks. In 1066, the Normans broke the Saxon sticks. In 1403, Henry won at Shrewsbury. Shrewsbury. He won at Shrewsbury. The shrew. He won at Shrewsbury. It wasn't his due. Without dates though, things tend to go awry. A broken hinge, a torn hem, a limp handle or two, all very distracting, and something Frank really ought to fix. Frank the swine. Frank the lazy git. Our landlord. So we'll have to soldier on without him. We'll have to soldier on without him. Without him. With a bit of string and glue. I'm not sure exactly what year Dad went missing, nor what year he was born, but sometime after the war, dear. Mum was born in 1947, and my aunt began her yelling 2 years earlier. So perhaps somewhere in between those years, my father's bones began to grow through the thick brick walls of the Gorbals. The thick brick walls of the Gorbals. Let's say so for now, shall we? Because the facts are blurry and broken. All that's left is his name and a few faint tunes. Laurie, that was his name. Laurie of Lauriston, on the banks of the River Clyde. Laurie, short for Lawrence, says Maze, my grandmother, who knew Dad before Mum did, before any of us did. Lawrence with a U, dear. I prefer Lawrence with a W myself, as in Lawrence of Arabia, ever so romantic. But there you have it. This one comes with a U. A U, dear. A U. Lawrence with a W sounds different, like Lordy, Lordy Loo, Lordy, Lordy Loo, says Maze all the time, especially when the news is on. Lordy, what a mess we're making of things, dear. And then she starts to sing. Wee Willie Winky, where have you gone? Upstairs and downstairs in your nightgown. Tapping at the window, crying out the door. Wee Willie Winky, where have you gone? Nowhere interesting, that's for sure, Mum said the day Dad left. And don't you go after him either. Not that Dad left any particular day, because Dad was always leaving. So how do you get someone back when they're gone? Close your eyes, dear, says Maze. Close your eyes and let the pictures come. But when I close my eyes, I can't see Dad. I can see my mother and my grandmother. I can see my aunts. But when I go looking for Dad, I can't find him. The men, they're never there. Okay, so that's the world you're in.
That is the world we're in. That's the world you've taken us in.
Yeah.
And Sally, I'm absolutely intrigued. And in my introduction, I did say both disturbing and uplifting. So here you are, reciting nursery rhymes, singing songs, so melodies make us feel good, it feels nice. And yet your preface is titled Drawing Blood. Your father, I mean, the fights, my goodness, somebody else could have written this book in quite a different way. I just want to read a short passage and ask you to say maybe a little bit more, if you're able to, in prosaic fashion, rather than in performance fashion. And by the way, folks who are listening, this book has dramatis personae, so we have a whole list of characters. It's absolutely fascinating. But fairly early in the book, you say, the trouble was Dad was never Dad. Dad wasn't a word we heard in our house. Not once, not ever. Dad, Daddy, Papa, Pop, Pierre, no. If Dad comes too late, it never sounds right. By that time, he's just your father. And anyone can have one of those. Father is too late and too far away. Father is further and further, as far from the house as possible, at the bottom of the garden by the back gate, which should always be closed. How many times have I told you? Now, shut that door. Brr. How can you sing, perform, recite nursery rhymes when you give us a sense of trauma of not having a papa, a dad, a daddy?
So the back gate that you've just referred to is a recurring image in this book of banishment and of exile. And it's a very powerful portal, if you like, for my imagination between those of us who remained in the house, locked inside what becomes in the child's mind a kind of castle or a fortress made of women. I grew up in an all-female household, and it was run a bit like a cult, which sounds very dramatic again, but this is how it was organized by my aunt, who was the leader. She, in some sense, took the place of men, Matt. So she, in some sense, turned herself into a patriarch and a kind of alternative father figure. She adopted the rhetoric of politicians and of rhetoricians who inspired her. A very bizarre mix of men, I have to say. Anything from Henry VIII, Cardinal Wolsey, Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, Pol Pot. She was fascinated by dictators, to the current politicians of the late 70s and the early 80s. Nigel Lawson makes an appearance. I think I say something about his eyebrows. So yeah, my actual father didn't have any hair, so I do have a memory of that. He was bald, so I think I was perhaps fascinated with the idea of men having facial hair, hence Henry VIII and so forth and so on. But our house was run like a matriarch, but the woman who ran it presumed the position of a patriarch. So it was a matriarchy run as though it were still nonetheless a kind of Victorian style house. And my aunt was at the head of the house. And I think as a child, I understood very quickly that power comes from the person who shouts and yells the loudest, but who also holds the words. So I needed, as a child, to find a way of gathering my own words, and also, I think, creating my own sense of fathering and fatherhood. And that's where I come around to the business of the history plays, Shakespeare's history plays, which I found in the town library, which was about 5 or 6 minutes walk from my Victorian house by the sea. And I learned to walk to the library as a regular routine on Saturday mornings after we'd done our chores, and 3 times a week after school. So I was back and forth between that library like a sort of holy Presbyterian, aged 5 onwards. By the time I got to Shakespeare, I was 12 or 13. And by the time I got to the history plays on this reading journey that I was on, I was 14. And at the age of 14, I found a surrogate father or fathers in the characters of Henry IV, and then Henry V as he becomes Prince Hal, who is the young prince before he's king, and then his fellow men, his company, his crowd, his band of men. Poins, who is one of his best friends from the court, and then his buffoon, clown, fat friend called Falstaff, who becomes, in a sense, my kin. I adopted Falstaff as my other self. And I should also explain to the audience that in terms of my own natural kin, I have brothers. So it was in a way, Falstaff, Poins, and Prince Hal, the three musketeers, if you like, were versions of my own natural kin, my brothers. And I was the girl among them trying to take on their modes and manners of behavior. I was the girl trying to be a boy.
Fascinating. By the way, this is being broadcast worldwide, and we've had some comments saying, loved your performance, Sally. So there you are, I tell you that. Now, before we get too far away from your parents, I want to focus a little bit also on your mother, who you've already said was my salvation. And this idea, and when I was reading this book, I thought, how did this author, how did you come out of this when there was so much blood around and so much absence? And again, your mum pops up. And I want to read a bit about her and then ask you to say a bit more, again, either in performance or prosaic fashion, whichever is your choice, Sally. Is that okay?
Of course.
Yeah. And this is a section, a chapter titled Titania and Oberon. Mum was yelling a lot that summer, and so we spent most of our time outside. While everyone else was down at the beach building sandcastles and covering themselves in sand, I was up on the downs, away with the fairies, reading Shakespeare. Get a bit of Shakespeare into you before it's too late, Mr. Drake yelled us at school, at us. For goodness sake, stop mucking about with that detective fiction rubbish, Mum yelled at me at home. You shouldn't be reading that at your age. It's far too late for that. What do you want with all that Agatha Christie nonsense? And then there's a piece of Shakespeare, and Sally writes, Mum knows this speech off by heart. She learnt it at school, and she says it every Sunday whenever she washes her hair. Mum's proud of her Shakespeare. I might have left school at 16, she says, but at least I went with a bit of Shakespeare in me. That's real poetry. I don't care what you say. No one does it better than Shakespeare. Now, girl, pass me that jug. What a multitasking mum.
Absolutely, absolutely, Matt. And actually, I'm standing by the kitchen sink here in my boat, and I think there's a definite reason for that. I associate Mum and Shakespeare with the sink, her doing my hair. In fact, I washed my hair just before we started. I was getting into performance, but Mum used to sing all the time as she was doing her chores, and I think she wanted us to know what good poetry was. She used to send me next door to a girl called Diane, who read poetry to me and discussed poetry to me. So although we were living on benefits, and although we were living in what turned out to be the local slum, and although there was a great deal of shame around that, there was elevation in my life, and it came from song and poetry. And yes, the child imagines that her mother is in fact Titania, and that the row that happens between Titania and Oberon in the woods outside Athens is in fact the row between her own father and her own mother, when her father comes back very occasionally to see if he can make amends, but he's chucked out by the ruling patriarch, who is the figure of my mother's sister, the aunt. He doesn't really stand a chance in this all-female regime. But my mother went to grammar school, Matt. She had an old-fashioned grammar school education, and she took a great deal of pride in improving herself and in furthering herself. So that was something that I did inherit. And I would say to you now that apart from the fact that I was able to have access to the public library, and the library in many ways is the heroine, I make her feminine, is the heroine of these books that I'm writing. The first part being Girl with Dove, where the library becomes the metaphor for salvation. Apart from that, there was my mother's attachment to an arts education. That she was musical, she had a good voice, she had learned to read music, and she'd learned to read poetry, and she had a capacity for learning things off by heart. So yes, that was part of my way out. That was part of my exit.
Good on for your mum. Well done, your mum, we say. Now, did you want to do another little bit? I mean, I've got loads of questions, but I don't want to tyrannize here.
Yes, I'd like to just give the audience a sense of the central character of this book, who is Falstaff, who is the dispossessed knight of Henry IV, Part 1 and 2, and probably one of the most beloved characters in the whole of Shakespeare. Falstaff in No Boy's Play here becomes a sort of riven metaphor for abundance, but also for lack. He has no title and he has no money. There's much mention of Falstaff being in debt. There's much mention of him having no money in his fat velvet purse. And I just want to try and give the audience a sense of the way in which Falstaff becomes a live character in the young girl's mind, the way that she adopts him as a kin, the way she begins to build an alternative genealogy, if you like, through the metaphor of his stomach, which she imagines herself buried and hidden away in. Inside Falstaff's stomach, if you like, is the whole world. Inside that stomach, swimming around with sherry, he loves sherry, or sack as Shakespeare calls it, and pickled herring, is also an alternative world, and it's the world of strange and peculiar words and metaphors that she's only just beginning to grasp in her mind. And it's those strange metaphors that the child protagonist in this book attaches herself to and almost swims away with them. So this is chapter 10. It's called Falstaff. And by this point in the book, we've actually entered fully into the world of Shakespeare. And the world of Shakespeare's plays are signaling the real world as well. They're standing in for both the world of the child in Sussex, in her seaside town, but also the world of Shakespeare. Falstaff, scene 2, the highway near Gad's Hill. Enter Prince Henry and Poins. Poins, come, shelter, shelter. I have removed Falstaff's horse, and he frets like a gummed velvet. William Shakespeare, Henry IV, Part 1. 3 men on a dark highway, not 2. 1 young, 1 fat, 1 scarcely seen. That's how it all begins. Prince Henry is the first, who goes by Hal. Prince Hal, hale and hearty, one of the lads. Enter Falstaff. But Falstaff's no lad, he's just lazy and slow as a slug or a bug in winter, a fatty out on the fringe, or a piece of velvet trailing along the ground. A gummed velvet, Poins call him. A gummed velvet, fallen from a tree, something fat and stuck, or something fat and becoming unstuck. A gummed velvet, fallen from a tree, something fat and becoming unstuck. Winnie the Pooh in his hole, a deer in headlights, a camel frozen to the spot, something silly for sure, because in Shakespeare, words mean several things at once. Something fat and stuck, gummed velvet, something fat and stuck, because in Shakespeare, words mean several things at once. So you'll just have to work it out. Keep your head, don't fret. Sometimes you might lose your horse like Falstaff, silly fat man. You might even lose your title like Falstaff, silly fat man. But eventually you'll find your way. Just follow the jog of the words, and remember, Gad's Hill is only 20 miles out of town. Gad's Hill is only 20 miles out of town, which isn't far from the spires of London town. Even a fat knight without his horse can make it home. Even a fat knight without his horse can make it home. Carry the words home, I say. Carry them home in your fat velvet purse. So that passage is really the beginning of the child bonding, knitting herself to the language of Falstaff. She doesn't quite understand the words yet. She isn't quite sure what gummed velvet means. It's actually related to the idea of a deer being killed, being slain, being shot, being wounded, being hunted and being shot down. She doesn't quite understand the implications of all of the layers of Shakespeare's words, but she knows that there's something there about the body. She's picked up instinctively on this idea of fatness and of largeness and of the visceral life that Falstaff is. And I think the reason why the child attaches herself so much to this sense of surplus body life is because in her house, there was no space to move or breathe or play. 4 rooms with 16 people in them. Okay, 4 rooms with 16 people in them, some of them quite large. So there's a sense there that Falstaff represents excess space because he needs excess space, he demands it. And I think there's something important there about the mathematics of space that she begins to feel through Falstaff. He's also being made much fun of. He spends most of his time hiding on the ground. He's not a good soldier. He's not a good hero. He's the anti-hero. He's not brave. He turns out to be a coward. And in this scene on Gad's Hill, which is perhaps the scene that became most important to me, he's stitched up, as they say nowadays, and made fun of by his peers, Poins and Prince Hal, because he loses his horse. Why does he lose his horse? Because they steal it from him. They play a trick on him. And I related very strongly, Matt, to this scene because most of my childhood was spent being tormented by boys playing tricks on me. So I had to find a way of fighting back. And the way I fought back was to be a smart aleck and talk in metaphor and riddle and rhymes, and understand that words have layeredness and that words can secrete you away and hide you away. And in fact, most of my Shakespeare reading went on down in the cellar, the dark cellar beneath our house, which was sort of a mouldy, dark hole, really, with one light bulb on. And I wanted to show the audience just one of the illustrations from this book, because they are quite wonderful. There's me in the cellar, or there's a version of me in the cellar with the light bulb on, reading my Shakespeare, looking quite intelligent, I think. Quite poised. I don't think I look that poised. I was anticipating a brother. Can you see that sort of portcullis effect? So there's the gate and the idea of the defense, if you like, behind. But I was expecting that to be bashed in at any point and to be interrupted, because my brothers would always want to come down and play with me in the cellar. It became our kind of Dungeons and Dragons setting. So the cellar becomes its own theatre space as well inside the book, inside this book, No Boys Play Here. But it also it is the actual space where she's doing her reading. And so it's a space where the theatre in her mind starts to unfold. It's dark, there's one light bulb, and you can't see all the things that are there, lots of mouldy boxes and bulbs lying around.
You mentioned just before you did that little reading, your use of image and metaphor, and
yes,
they're arresting and they lift off the page to me. They're an absolute delight. And on the theme of Falstaff and the identity with him, I want to read a little passage where you use, which is just titled, or rather the chapter is titled, Colted. And for the audience out there, we can see it. It's C-O-L-T-E-D. Interesting, from the word colt. Here we go. Falstaff, what plague mean ye to colt me thus? Henry, part 4. Anyway, a colt is a baby horse. A colt is a horse with bendy legs. A colt is a horse learning to walk. When all the other horses see the colt fall over, they snort and laugh. A colt is someone who is teased and goaded. A colt is a young horse who lags behind the mares. From an early age, I knew I was being colted. I was colted by the boys. First, a house full of them, boys who didn't like to keep a serious face or to frown. So I did all the frowning for them. I read and I read and I frowned and I frowned. Sally, go out into the sun now and stop all your frowning. Close that book and go outside, for goodness sake. Go and play with the boys. But I read and I frowned. I frowned and I was colted. To be colted is to lose your mount, your horse, your position in the scheme of things. If a knight loses his horse, he is done for. If you have no horse, then you are no soldier of rank, nothing but a foot soldier. If you lose your horse, you're vulnerable to attack. Soon enough, those deadly arrows will get you. If you are a foot soldier, you must stand fast, no matter how many silver points you see coming your way. Any soldier with any sense would say farewell to that and flee. So, sometime around the age of 14, I began to desert my brothers, my future men. The arrows were coming thick and fast. I could no longer stand fast. So I ran from the battlefields into the woods. I said farewell to the lads. Didn't you?
I did, Matt. It's actually very moving hearing you speak it out too. And to be colted there is to be made a fool of. It's to be lowered. It's to be made into a baby, somebody without a title, without a position, without a rank, as you're saying. So, and a knight who loses his horse becomes a foot soldier. He becomes a nobody. It's also a metaphor for losing your dignity. And I think the child is determined to maintain her dignity in a house where she's being assaulted all the time by boys who are japing and messing around. And she's being raised in a local culture, in a culture of kinship that's about tomfoolery. So you had to be a fool in order to survive. And of course, that's what Falstaff tries to do. He tries to be cleverer and to outwit Poins and Howl, but in the end, he's done for. And he's done for because he doesn't have the physical prowess of the soldier that will save him. He's exposed as being a man who lacks the traditional qualities of the hero, which is to say physical strength and prowess and valor, and which are forms of virtue. Now, my brothers obviously could beat me up, and they did. And, you know, there's a way in which that was play. But I think there's a difficult kind of, again, mathematics of the body when you're the only girl and you're surrounded by a troop of boys. So I had to find my own armaments, my own weaponry, my own arrows. And my arrows were my words. And in this book, words do quite literally become weapons. They become sticks and stones. And those sticks and stones were used against my brothers, but most importantly, they were used against my aunt, who held all the rhetorical power in the household. She was the narrator. She was the grand narrator. And her sources, as I've already said, were the words of politicians and rhetoricians. So I had to go one step further and one step higher. So, and in the history plays, of course, of Shakespeare, those who win, apart from those with the soldierly prowess, like Henry IV, who then becomes Henry V, Prince Hal, who becomes Henry V, those who win are those who have the best rhetoric. So this is what I understood. I had to get some good words.
It's terrific, Sally. We're entering the last 10 minutes or so. If there's anyone out there who wants to ask a question, now is your chance. Let's just see if there are any. But meanwhile, Sally, did you have another piece you wanted to?
A very short piece, a very short piece.
That's becoming lovely.
A very short piece, which I think summarizes that sense of shame that young people feel when their body is beginning to change from being perhaps quite flat like a boy when you're a kid to being something a bit more feminine and female. And this is really towards the end of the book when the narrator starts to begin to show sympathy for both men and women, for girls turning into boys, for boys and for boys that might perhaps also feel feminine in some way. So it's really a statement about androgyny and the relationship between androgyny and theatre. And it's called An Embarrassing Scene. One year I played a boy in the school play and I wore a pair of my brother's trousers. Oh, look what she's wearing. And they were tight on the behind, or my behind made them tight. Look what she's wearing. And suddenly, there I was, a girl in the wrong clothes. I wore a top hat, which I had to take off and tip to some lady or the other. And the top hat was stiff and tall and stiff, and the brim too small to hide behind. The brim was too small to hide behind. The hat was silver and caught the light, and I was sure I'd joined the circus. And the silver foil crinkled, and the crowd on stage and the crowd in the crowd began to look at me. Look at her! Oh, look at her! Doesn't she look funny? They looked so long, my cheeks began to turn pink, and the hair beneath my silver hat began to burn. Then the lady opposite, whose hand I had to kiss, began to laugh. Look at her, look at her. And that was the end of my being a boy. Boys can bear anything except scoffing and pointing. Look at him, look at him. Whereas girls expect only that. To be ashamed of something or the other, leaking out a laugh, a cry, a whimper, a sliver of running blood. And so there was my mum moving ahead in her peachy dress that hot summer with a streak of red running down her leg. And she was moving side to side like a lumbering beast until they began to look like trotters, her legs. And I wished ever so much she was wearing trousers. I wished ever so much Mum was wearing trousers. Mum, why aren't you wearing trousers? Why aren't you wearing trousers, Mum? Made from the velvet curtains. But the curtains were my waistcoat and my sash, which fitted me secure as sleep. And so Mum's legs stuck out like a streak of rashy bacon. Look at her.
Thank you, Sally. Terrific. I want to come back to something on that, but we have a question from someone online, from Catherine, and she says, I'd like to ask Sally how her relationship with Shakespeare has evolved. How do you read her plays now? How does she read her plays, Shakespeare's plays now?
I actually, it's interesting, when you go back and read things that you've read as a child, you still have the same magnetic pull to the same scenes. So for me, Henry IV will always be about Gad's Hill. And as an adult, you then begin to, perhaps you even begin to feel a bit shamed about the way that you pay too much attention to one area as a child, because you are building a relationship with those characters. I also now understand that I did not understand a lot of the metaphors that I was feeding myself, that I was instinctively and unconsciously devouring as forms of food. And metaphor in this book is a kind of food. But I think in some way I was glad that I did not know the meaning of all those words, because I was attached to them unconsciously. And I think it was the unconscious force, the half understood, that half known but not fully known relationship to words that kept me going. So I read difficult plays after Henry IV Part 1 and 2, which are difficult in the sense there are a lot of characters and there's quite a lot of dialect. But I actually think Henry V is a harder play in some sense, because it becomes more global. You've got France, you know, and all the rest of that. So it's quite a lot of geography to take on. But yeah, I now understand, you know, I could tell you what the meaning of what gum velvet, the four meanings of it. I didn't know when I was a child it had to do with a slain deer. Did it matter? No, it didn't. Gum velvet for me was quite literally the velvet curtains that my mum got from the charity shop, that she used to sew up the raggedy bottom of our curtains so it didn't look so embarrassing if we had someone come in, which we almost never did. So I imagine that Falstaff was lying around on the ground at the bottom of our raggedy curtains, like a piece of velvet stuck on to the bottom, you see. And in some sense, he was a stuck-on. He's a stuck-on character. And I stuck him on to me.
What you've just said in that answer makes me think of the importance of good reading, even at an early age that we maybe don't understand. And it will sow seeds that germinate in time. And that's clearly the case with you. And it makes me want to read a passage unusually from your acknowledgements, right? So from your acknowledgements right at the end, finally, I owe much to my teachers, but especially to Mr. Harding of Littlehampton Community School, who taught me what poetry can do for a life. Vicky Craver of Brighton and Hove Albion Sixth Form College for teaching me The Tempest in the most unforgettable way. Dave, the drama teacher, for showing me that Perdita might be lost, but she is also found. And Mr. Dalrymple, who first brought me to Shakespeare via those dark woods outside Athens. And they clearly planted something. And at a literature festival, I think it's important to shout that from the rooftops. It's worth sowing those seeds as early as possible. Give me the child before it's 7. And I'll give you the lover of literature later in life. I want to ask you a final question. The book starts with blood on the steps, you talking about your father, you going into literature to find something, your mother helping you in a way your father didn't. And then right towards the end, you say, my father had a difficult life and he never found a suitable role to lead him away from it, which seemed like a sentence full of compassion, no metaphor. How do you finish? I mean, as a man and as a father, I'm very interested in that, if you don't mind me asking that, Sally.
Yes, he never found a role for himself, Matt, because he never found a profession for himself. My father was broken by his own childhood, raised in the Gorbals of Glasgow, where fighting and hitting your wife or fighting your brother fighting your neighbor and drinking was just a way of life. And he never managed to overcome that original, that primal scene, if you like. He never managed to translate himself into the workaday world, where he had a structure and a profession of some kind. He trained to be a nurse, but the alcohol kept him back. He was never able to fully hold down a job. He was a labourer for a short time, but he hurt his back when he fell off a building site. So he never really made it into the material world. And I think for a man not to make it into the material world, as Falstaff really doesn't when he loses his horse, when he fails to get his army together, it's complete and utter failure in the most basic physical, material, everyday sense. And that's where this book, I think, speaks very strongly to the male understanding of shame.
Sally, your love of good writing and the value of words in a helpful, life-enhancing way is tremendous to hear. I'd love to have you back at the Swindon Festival of Literature live one day, if you'd leave your lovely boat and your lovely books. The Swindon Festival of Literature says thanks to our technician today, Kat. Thank you very much for making everything run smoothly. But most of all, a Swindon, and also thanks audience out there worldwide, wherever you are. Great that you joined us. But most of all, a Swindon Festival of Literature thank you to Sally Bayley. Thank you very much, Sally.
Thank you very much for having me, and I'd love to come back live.